Okay, good evening, everybody. We're going to get started. So thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Katrina Furlanetto, and I am the General Manager of Cataraqui Region Conservation Authority, and I will be your moderator this evening. Welcome to our public engagement session on the 5-year update to our guidelines for implementing Ontario Regulation 14806, development, interference with wetlands, and alterations to shorelines and watercourses under Section 28 of the Conservation Authorities Act. Before we begin, Cataraqui Conservation acknowledges that we are situated on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee. As a conservation authority, we are committed to learning from and alongside the Indigenous peoples of this land on how we can be reciprocal guardians of the land. We thank the Indigenous peoples for their continued care and protection of all our relations. We are dedicated to ensuring that all of creation is preserved and promoting sustainable living in our community with direct actions that benefit Indigenous access to protected lands. Again, thank you for taking the time this evening to join us and provide comments as part of our public consultation process. One of the goals for this update was to increase engagement across the watershed community, which we achieved. We received input from across the watershed from municipalities, adjacent conservation authorities, local residents, community-based organizations, marine contractors, and the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. Many of the comments were constructive, and it is the intent of Cataraqui Conservation staff this evening to provide clarification and context to the proposed guideline updates, address perceptions, and where appropriate, will reconsider the approach taken within the context of our mandate. Cataraqui Conservation strives to be clear in our guideline language, and we hope tonight's session will address many of the concerns brought forward over the last several weeks. As an on-the-ground watershed management organization working on behalf of municipalities, the province, watershed residents, we felt strongly that a transparent and broad public consultation process across the watershed would help to inform this next update. We want to work with the community to create guidelines that consider the watershed characteristics Under the Conservation Authorities Act, we are responsible for natural hazards management, which includes the regulation of development within and near wetlands and along shorelines and watercourses. Cataraqui Conservation is mandated to support the protection of people and property over the long term. How we do this work is based on local direction from board-approved guidelines, which incorporates policy, educational language to address challenges we face on the watershed, and future considerations to be adaptable to changing watershed conditions. With that in mind, it is important to remember that the guidelines under review are used to direct Cataraqui Conservation staff in implementing Ontario regulations within our watershed, and that the guidelines are written regarding development to be permissive. Each project, property, and circumstance is different, so the guidelines are intended to provide our professional staff with a consistent approach when reviewing applications. There are mechanisms in place for helping staff that are unable to provide approval. So where permission can be granted by the board for projects, it must be demonstrated that the control of flooding, erosion, dynamic beaches, pollution, or the conservation of land will not be affected by the proposed development. This process will be discussed further in the session this evening. So speaking to the update, the majority of existing guidelines remain unchanged. Our intent through this update process is to therefore clarify areas of confusion. We see hundreds of applications that are incomplete based on similar trends, so we endeavor to clarify definitions and outline what's needed for a complete application. This will decrease delays for landowners and get projects started sooner. We also wanted to provide proposed solutions to improve interpretation and uncertainty, as we recognize existing policies can be challenging to implement consistently. In doing so, our intent is to help landowners and businesses better understand the requirements for completing a permit application, reduce interim application communication between applicants, and ultimately expedite permit processing. We also want to educate on the considerations staff give to each permit application while incorporating process updates, technical references, and clerical changes to improve the overall guideline document. We will continue to work on these items as the update process continues. From a process perspective, once this session is complete, any further feedback will be incorporated into a report that will be brought to our Planning and Permitting Ad Hoc Committee. This is a committee that is made up of a subset of our board members who will review and consider recommendations from staff. The ad hoc committee, once satisfied with the updates and content, will then make a recommendation to our full authority board for consideration and ultimately approval. For this evening's session, our approach is to speak to several key themes that were presented within the comments received, as we will not be able to address each and every comment. Staff will be providing a presentation followed by an opportunity to ask questions, voice concerns, and discuss the topics presented this evening. I respectfully remind everyone participating this evening that this session is an opportunity to work together towards improving the current procedures. Please be respectful with your comments and questions, stay on scope, and be mindful of timing. Anyone who cannot follow this code of conduct will be asked to leave the meeting. We thank you for your continued cooperation and participation this evening. I will now turn it over to our staff, Mike Dakin and Kristen Wozniak, who will be speaking about the update specifically.
Yes, thank you, Katrina, and good evening to everyone. Thank you all for attending this evening. I'll give a brief introduction to the presenters tonight, starting with myself. I'm Michael Dakin. I'm the Supervisor of Development Review here at Cataraqui Conservation.
Sorry, can I ask people to please turn their cameras off?
Thank you.
Charles, kid, would you mind turning your camera off?
Thank you. Again, my name is Michael Dakin. I'm Supervisor of Development Review here at CRCA, and I have 11 years experience with the Conservation Authority. And with me is Kristen Wozniak. She's Resource Planner, and she has roughly 6 years of experience as well. So we expect our presentation to run about 40 minutes, and the intent is to help provide some background information, to discuss some key themes from the comments we received, and hopefully to provide, a look at what we'll be considering moving forward. So just as an overview of our presentation, we'll provide an introduction to Cataraqui Conservation, recognizing that not everyone is familiar with the work we do. We'll provide an overview of the guidelines update and the regulation itself, that being Ontario Regulation 14806. We'll provide information on the feedback received, and as Katrina mentioned, we'll provide an overview of the key themes that we derived from the consultation process, as well as then discussing next steps. I also wanted to mention that Cataraqui Conservation, as a conservation authority, it does cover a very wide geographic area, as you can see on the slide here. Our jurisdiction extends from Brockville in the east to Napanee in the west, and then all the way up to Westport in the north. So it covers roughly a population of roughly 270,000 residents, along with a lot of waterfront properties, as you can imagine, including both the Thousand Islands area, as well as the backcountry lakes and the Canadian Shield Frontenac access area. Next slide. So just some information now on Ontario Regulation 14806. So the regulation in full is known as Development, Interference with Wetlands, and Alterations to Shorelines and Watercourses, and is pursuant to Section 28 of the Conservation Authorities Act. The Conservation Authorities Act itself was established in 1946 in response to erosion and drought concerns, recognizing that these and other resource initiatives are best managed on a watershed basis. After 1956, in response to Hurricane Hazel, which was quite a devastating extreme weather event with a lot of economic and human losses, there were amendments made to the Act that empowered conservation authorities to create regulations to prohibit filling in floodplains, to prohibit or control construction and alteration to waterways and wetlands. So the Act empowers conservation authorities to create regulations to regulate development within and adjacent to natural hazards and wetlands. Ontario Regulation 14806 is a provincially mandated regulation. and each conservation authority in Ontario has a similar regulation. There are some differences in the details of each regulation, depending on the geographic conditions, but overall, the intent and overriding principles are the same. Slide. The purpose of Ontario Regulation 14806 is first and foremost to protect life and property from risk from natural hazards. And when I say property, it's important to keep in mind, we don't just mean land, but we mean buildings and structures that people own. So people's investment, essentially. Secondly, the purpose is to ensure that proposed changes to a property, for example, development and site alteration, are not affected by natural hazards such as flooding and erosion, and conversely, to ensure that these changes do not put other properties at greater risk from those same natural hazards. From that perspective, we're looking to ensure that individuals' properties and development is protected, but conversely, that actions to individuals' properties don't affect their neighbors. So the question is often asked, why do we regulate in this manner? We do because this is the provincial approach as defined by the Ontario government through the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, and that's outlined in the provincial technical guides for natural hazards. And the approach is first and foremost to direct development, buildings and structures away from the hazard. Especially important in these times where we know extreme weather events are getting worse and more frequent. So fundamental to our approach, as with other conservation authorities across Ontario, is prevention and avoidance. The idea, again, to reiterate, is to protect people and property, but also the intent is also to protect residents of the province from the financial burden associated with natural hazards, especially natural hazards damage relief. If you look at some recent examples of costs to taxpayers, in 2021 in British Columbia, the cost to taxpayers was roughly $500 million from flooding events from uninsured damages. And more locally, in 2019, the Ottawa River flooding event led to $3.8 million in damages, uninsured damages, that the taxpayer ultimately had to foot that bill. So the idea, as I said before, is to avoid those situations by directing development away from the hazard. The purpose is not to protect the natural environment for its own sake. This is the purpose of other legislation and policy, but instead, or at the same time, natural hazards avoidance and environmental protection do go hand in hand. If you're developing in a way that's protected from natural hazards, there's a good chance that the development will also protect the natural environment, but it's important to keep in mind that's not the mandate of the Conservation Authority. So in terms of what we actually regulate, we just wanted to provide some points here. We regulate development in river or stream valleys, in and near wetlands and along shorelines. We also regulate the straightening, changing, and diverting or interfering in any way with existing channels or rivers, creeks, streams, watercourses, or also changing or interfering in any way with wetlands. So essentially, at the core, water features we're talking about, and the hazards that are associated with these water features. As some specific examples and ones that are pertinent to tonight's discussion are activities such as permanent docks, boathouses, boat ports, shore walls, buildings and structures, placement of fill, grading, and excavation. Those are all activities that we do regulate. Types of activities that we don't regulate include removable docks, structures less than 10 square meters, vegetation removal, like tree cutting, unless this tree cutting results in interference with a wetland. And next slide. Now I'll hand it over to Kristen for her part of the presentation.
Thanks, Mike. So we'll get into the actual guidelines, which is the document that's being updated currently. So our guidelines that implement the regulation were originally developed in 2008, and its intent was to provide staff with consistency when reviewing permit applications. And this is important when we're dealing with site-by-site cases, with the understanding that not every proposal property or landscape is the same. So the document was developed using framework established by the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry through technical guidelines, as well as Conservation Ontario involvement. And it is reviewed every 5 years just to ensure that any legislative and policy changes are accurately reflected. So where staff are unable to support approval of an application based on regulatory guidelines, or if our guidelines do not adequately address or speak to requirements for a certain proposal, an applicant does have the right under section 2812 of the Conservation Authorities Act to request a hearing in front of the Cataraqui Conservation Full Authority Board for further approval consideration. So in a hearing, staff will outline why approval cannot be supported based on considerations of the guidelines, or explain how the guidelines do not address that particular proposal. And the applicant then has the opportunity to establish their case and provide further evidence. So in that instance, the board may approve an application outright. They may approve it with conditions, or they can deny the application. Where the board denies the applicant still does have additional opportunity to appeal this decision through the Ontario Lands Tribunal or through the Minister of Natural Resources and Forestry. And in the past, we have also had an outcome from an appeal process that has informed subsequent changes to the guidelines. So it's also important to note and to highlight that the regulation is generally permissive in nature, and while it may not seem so in some circumstances, we are solution-based. We do try hard to work with applicants to find a supportable option that meets the intent of the guidelines and what the landowner is looking to achieve at the end of the day. But we do recognize that there are times where there is merit of a proposal needing to be considered by the board. Next slide, please. So the guideline update overview. So the purpose of the update and what we're considering, again, the main purpose is to maintain consistency with current legislation and policy, which changes over time. And it also allows staff to address reoccurring themes which may come up over the span of the 5 years to determine whether certain changes are warranted based on our changing landscape. So the process of updating the guidelines is not just completed and approved at a staff level. While the process is led by staff within the development review team, a planning and permitting ad hoc committee is also established, which is essentially a subcommittee of members from the full authority board. The committee is responsible for reviewing staff recommended changes throughout various stages of the update process, and they provide feedback to staff and ultimately make decision whether further revisions are warranted or can be approved to proceed through the next stages of the update process. Minutes from each meeting are brought forward to the full authority board and received, and it is ultimately the full authority board which is required to approve and adopt the final updated guidelines. So to date, the 2022 guideline update process started in January. And this is where staff began their in-depth internal review, where we also reached out to neighboring CAs and other relevant agencies on certain aspects. Between March and May, we had numerous meetings with the Planning and Permitting Ad Hoc Committee to review different stages of the proposed updates. And this included minor housekeeping revisions and high-level discussions on some of the more substantive policy pieces, which were then narrowed down with specific policy wording edits. And then once this process was completed and supported by the committee, we received board approval in June to consult on the draft changes. So unlike the Planning Act, the Conservation Authority technically does not have legislative requirement to undertake consultation as part of the regulatory guideline update process. However, we feel that this is a critical part of updating the guidelines, and in order to maintain transparency with our watershed community, we consult each time there is an update to the guidelines. So this past year, we completed a more robust outreach, which was one of the most extensive we've ever done. In doing so, we directly reached out to a much broader community, including various ministries, our member municipalities, lake associations, engineer and environmental consultant groups, marine contractors. It was also encouraged just to further distribute that consultation information in order to spread the word. And details were also posted on our website through social media platforms and also news releases to try and reach out even further to the public community. So this year, the consultation window is open between July 4th to the 29th. And we, understanding that, methods for reaching out to residents is ever evolving, especially in today's society. We have historically tried various forms of outreach in support of public consultation. And we found that, that we tend to be most successful through electronic and virtual methods. So while we have conducted open house sessions in the past, this past year we chose an electronic format. And we received the most comments we have ever through consultation, which is great. We heard from many of the entities that I had mentioned, including residents within our watershed. And through the commenting process, we received a lot of positive support from partnering agencies and community groups through constructive comments, but we also felt that it was important to provide follow-up opportunity through today's public information session to address some of the other recurring concerns which were expressed through the consultation period. So in support of the overall update process, we do intend to consider all the comments that were submitted, which will be vetted through the Planning and Permitting Ad Hoc Committee. However, for the purpose of today's session, we will only be getting into some key themes that received a lot of feedback. And some of these major themes include legal non-conforming rights and a number of updates associated with our in-water work guideline policies. And this includes shore docks, dock staving, storage spaces in boathouse and boat ports, new flat roofed boathouse and boat port restrictions, as well as lot line projection issues. So with that said, I will pass it back over to Mike to lead us into our first topic.
Thanks, Kristen. I'll speak about the first key theme that we found through the consultation process, that being the idea and the topic of legal non-conforming rights. So legal non-conforming rights, for those that aren't as familiar, in a nutshell, they're also known as grandfathering rights. It's the idea that a building or structure can be rebuilt and in some cases expanded as of right, so automatically. And this concept, this legal precedent, this doctrine is applicable under the Planning Act. So in terms of what was proposed and why, first of all, I have to start by saying that no new policies and no change to existing policies was proposed. Instead, additional introductory text in the guidelines document was proposed to be added to section 2.1 of the document. The intent being to clarify how legal non-conforming rights are considered in the context of the Conservation Authorities Act and under Ontario Regulation 14806. In terms of what we've heard, from the feedback received, it's obvious that the intended clarity was not achieved, and instead it may have resulted in further confusion, which was the opposite of what we intended. For example, there seems to be confusion that these changes would prohibit people from using non-conforming buildings and structures or repairing or renovating existing buildings and structures. Also, there's some confusion perhaps that rights were being taken away, and I'd like to say that that's not the case, and there are no implications for the use, repair, and renovation of existing structures. So in terms of what we're considering moving forward, we recognize that the additional contextual piece was unnecessary and likely not warranted in the guidelines document. So what we'll do is recommend to the Planning and Permitting Ad Hoc Committee that the additional introductory text, that context piece that we recommended, that it simply be removed. It's important to keep in mind, this won't change how we implement our regulation. We'll continue to work with applicants on a case-by-case basis to find solutions that meet their needs, but also uphold the intent of the regulation, which, as we've said already, is to protect people and property. Kristen has the next slide.
So the next key theme that we received comments on were associated with shore dock. So what was proposed and why? When it comes to existing dock development, which spans a large portion parallel to the shoreline, which we refer to as shore docks, our existing policies and the parameter, which how they are assessed has not changed as a result of the proposed updates. So the intent was to add additional wording to help people understand the parameters of what we can and cannot support. Exceptions for shore docks have always been in place, and we're trying to highlight them so people know there can be situations where they are appropriate. But there need to be parameters, otherwise there's inconsistency. So the reason the additional wording was included was in response to a growing concern of types of development that do not meet the intent of the regulation and the provincial approach to natural hazard management. And again, that primary focus is on prevention and avoidance. So what we heard was interpretation that we are only classifying a shore dock as a deck if they are being used for sitting on or putting chairs on, or if this is considered an unacceptable level of risk, and that chairs on a dock are now considered illegal or not permitted based on Cataraqui Conservation review. So questions regarding the actual definition of what is considered to be an unacceptable level of risk, as well as some confusion that we are not permitting any docks parallel to the shoreline, which is not the case. So what we're considering moving forward, so staff will look at revising the wording to ensure that necessary clarification is made, which includes removing the term unacceptable level of risk. And we'll look to refine any areas of confusion in the proposed changes for consideration of the committee. The additional wording was not intended to prevent the use and enjoyment of property, marine facilities, or prohibit people from the use of their docks, but rather is a need to uphold the intent of natural hazard avoidance, with the understanding that marine facilities by their nature need to be in the hazard versus decks and other uses which do not. So we fully acknowledge that using the term unacceptable level of risk was the wrong terminology. And what we're trying to get at is consideration of unnecessary risk. And this comes back to the concept of prevention and avoidance of certain types of development within the hazard. Staff also want to clarify that this is not necessarily an ecological matter. However, natural hazards avoidance and environmental protection are integrated, and there are environmental benefits to good natural hazard-based designs. Next slide, please. So the next topic was associated with dock staving. So what was proposed and why? Staff proposed a new bullet under our dock policies to address the manner of how dock staving should be installed as to not hinder or impede the movement and flow of water within a water body. So the purpose of this policy item was added as a response to yearly complaints from neighbors whose property, which again includes their shoreline, as well as structural marine development, were being impacted by adjacent dock development, which enclosed staving based on resulting impacts from changes to flow of water movement, pollutants, buildup, and flooding impacts. So on the presentation slide, the upper photo in the presentation is an example of a solid staving with no gaps between the staving boards. That extends down directly touching the bed of the water body, which essentially creates a solid dock structure, and it does prohibit movement of water and eliminating fish passage and habitat. And if you look closely at the bottom of the photo, you can see where the average high water level is by the water marks. And that staving length extends past this mark, and in theory could be extended a bit further if safety is still a concern during periods of low water events. So what we heard through the comments was resident concern that the intent of this new policy item was to restrict staving from extending past the high water line. We recognize the benefits and purpose of having dock staving, and the intent of this policy item was not to restrict staving length so that it cannot touch the water, but primarily to allow for a suitable design, which will still allow marine vessels to be safely moored adjacent to marine facilities while not negatively impacting movement or flow of water. So what we're considering moving forward is, while the recommended wording for this policy does not explicitly state staving should be installed no lower than the high water level, staff will recommend revising and adding language to more clearly explain the intent of this policy item. And that'll be further considered by the Planning and Permitting Ad Hoc Committee. Next slide, please. So the next piece was associated with storage space in boat houses and boat ports. So what was proposed and why? Our existing policies do not currently permit any form of storage space within a marine facility. So the intent of this policy revision was to actually allow for some storage space up to 10 square meters in size. That does not need to be flood-proofed within a boathouse or a boat port. So this was considered as a response to practical need for marine-related storage in marine facilities, with the understanding that we cannot control what is stored, only the scale. The intent of using the term marine-related in the explanation was so that these spaces weren't necessarily turned into living space. So what we heard were concerns that this update was being changed to further restrict storage capability in marine facilities, that we are now restricting what can be stored within these spaces, which is not the case. And we also heard concerns about pollutants and contaminants in the hazard, since the storage spaces are not required to be flood-proof. So what we're considering moving forward, again, understanding that this policy change is actually an improvement to existing policies, we will look at revising the definition of a boathouse just to more clearly outline permitted storage use details. Include wording in the in-water guidelines appendix that outlines permitted storage size, and to address the concerns regarding pollutants and contaminants in the hazard. We will also look at adding proposed wording which recommends more best management practices through design features, like keeping containers on shelving units above the floodplain elevation. So a general notice, while we did have a couple comments regarding living space in marine facilities, and our current policies do not allow new living spaces, and there have been no proposed changes in this regard. The current policies are consistent with the intent of our regulation, provincial approach, municipal policies, and with the conservation authorities. Next slide, please. So the next theme was flat roofed boathouses and boat ports. So what was proposed and why? So staff acknowledged that this was a significant proposed change to policy, which includes no longer supporting new flat roofed boathouses and boat ports, and only supporting new marine structures with an angled or sloped roof line. So the intent of this policy change was to address a growing trend of these structures utilizing the roof as deck and patio spaces, which could also lead to further enclosure and additional living space not currently supported under our regulatory guidelines. Staff are also seeing an increase in planning-related applications, which require a minor variance or zoning bylaw amendment to recognize the explicit use of flat roofs on marine facilities as decks. So again, marine facilities by their nature, they are required to be located within the flood and erosion hazard in order to accommodate for mooring and storage of marine vessels, whereas deck development at greater than 10 square meters in size is required to meet applicable setbacks from the flood and erosion hazard under our current guideline policies. And based on this, staff felt that the utilization of the roof as a deck was contrary to the intent of our guideline for protecting forms of development and property that should be located outside of the hazard. So what we heard was concern that this type of development restriction should be assessed through other applicable legislation, some examples that were given were the building code or municipal zoning bylaws. That Cataraqui Conservation should not be comparing this type of development. Other CAs and Parks or Rideau Valley Conservation Authority and Parks Canada policies based on different heritage justifications, and also just some general misconception on hazard related impacts. So what we're considering moving forward, first, staff now recognize that we need to focus more on a holistic use-based design versus benign design that is used inappropriately for the structure in its entirety. So what this means is looking at the potential impact of actual additional living space within marine facilities versus temporary uses like sitting on a roof or deck of a boathouse or boatport. So this comes back to the overall intent of the structure. Again, the overall intent should not be to allow for living space within a marine facility, which we, again, already have long-standing policies to manage within our guidelines. So this approach is also supported by the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry through some recent discussions that we have had with ministry staff. And based on all this understanding, staff will be recommending revisions which include removing this proposed policy update of restricting roof styles on boathouse and boatports. Again, for further consideration of the Planning and Permitting Ad Hoc Committee. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the last item that we'll be speaking to specifically is the policy we added about lot line projection. So what was proposed and why? Staff proposed the addition of a policy identifying where feasible, marine facilities should not extend beyond the projected lot line of the property. And the reason for this policy addition was because staff receive a high volume of complaints on a yearly basis by concerned residents who have neighbors that are constructing marine facilities encroaching onto their waterfront over the water. So the intent of including this policy item was primarily as a best management practice to reduce neighboring conflicts over navigational matters and to avoid civil disputes, which the Conservation Authority unfortunately is often pulled into. So what we heard is landowner concern that projected lot line disputes are not a natural hazards matter and should be implemented by municipalities through their zoning bylaw, not by the Conservation Authority under our regulatory guidelines. So what we are considering moving forward, we definitely recognize that this policy piece is not a natural hazards matter. So staff will recommend removing this item from the guideline update, so there's a confusion. But we will continue to provide information and feedback when complaints come in. But let landowners know that property boundary disputes are outside our authority to enforce and should be dealt with by other relevant agencies. And this may include the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, since projected lot lines do technically cover Crown land, as well as their local municipality, or it can also be dealt with as a private civil matter. So just something to note, while some municipalities within our watershed have zoning bylaw provisions associated with side yard setback restrictions, which include projected lot lines, there are a number of municipalities that do not. So where opportunity prevents itself through municipal zoning bylaw updates, staff do encourage that members of the public provide comment to their municipality, which speaks to strengthening those policies associated with development constraints when it comes to projected lot lines. So I do just want to reference the photo provided in the slide and flag that while the parcel layer is not 100% accurate, which are the yellow lines you see there, the intent of the photo is to show that there are properties that are quite constrained and congested when it comes to their waterfront, and that marine development, if encroaching onto neighboring lots, can create substantial navigational or access issues for neighboring properties. The next slide, and I believe I will be turning that back over to Mike.
Thanks, Kristen. So those are the main things that we found through, again, the consultation process. And hopefully that touched on many of the concerns or issues that many of you may have had tonight. And we recognize that there certainly could be many more, and that's the intent of the question and answer period following our presentation, and we'll hope to answer as many as possible. But in terms of next steps, first and foremost, we will carefully consider all comments received, and that includes not just during the consultation period in the summer, but comments we've received since then, comments that we'll receive tonight, and comments afterwards. We will consider all those comments from the public, from stakeholders, from partner agencies across the watershed. We will be, as a next step, providing a status report to the Planning and Permitting Ad Hoc Committee, essentially a synopsis of the consultation period to date, along with a summary of tonight's event. And as it's been noted multiple times, we'll also be hosting this session as well for additional people to view. We'll also then provide a status report similar to the one going to the Planning and Permitting Ad Hoc Committee, to the Full Authority Board at our next Full Authority meeting at the end of October. I want to just reiterate, decisions won't be made there on adopting the policies. We don't anticipate that will happen anytime soon, given the amount of comments and the work we still have to do to go through those and do further assessment. What the intent is instead is to update our board to keep our board members up to date on consultation and discuss which additional consultation and which additional actions we can do moving forward before we start to review the process and refine the draft changes, which will follow from that report. Those reports will be publicly available, and we do intend to respond and notify each person who has commented and groups that have commented on what the proposed draft changes are. Ultimately, we'll get to a point where a revised draft will go to the Planning and Permitting Ad Hoc Committee, as well as our board for review. And ultimately, our board will be responsible for adopting the proposed changes to the guidelines. I think it's important to say that, and hopefully this you got the sense, is that we'll commit to taking the time necessary to get this process right, and hopefully, we anticipate that the Planning and Permitting Ad Hoc Committee, along with the board, will weigh the merits of further consultation and determine what appropriate next steps are. And most importantly, we will communicate this process and any updates clearly and regularly to the public and stakeholders, including when changes take effect. So at this point, I want to say thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to provide this information. We hope that it's been helpful and perhaps clarified a few things. We're glad that people are engaged. This was our intent from the outset. That's why, as Kristen said, we consulted more broadly than we have ever in the past. Our hope was to get a high level of feedback, and that's certainly what happened. I also want to say that in addition to the information we provide, we encourage you to review other information available, including the report that was circulated. All of that information is available on the website, as well as other supplemental information. For example, if you have questions, concerns about the CRCA's CRCA's permitting role in the process, information is available at the link provided below there, cataraquiconservation.ca/pages/permits. If you're interested in learning more about the Conservation Authorities Act in general, the link there is provided to the Act. There's also a link to the regulation under the Act that we're speaking to tonight. And then if you're interested about conservation authorities in general across Ontario, there's a link there to our umbrella organization, Conservation Ontario. So as we move into the question and answer session, if people have questions, but they're not comfortable or they just not ready at this point to raise them in the Q&A session, you can always contact us in other ways, and we commit to getting back to you. And if people have questions specific to their own property or a proposal that they're contemplating, that they're considering, please contact staff. We have a formal inquiry process for these types of questions that is set up, and we do commit to getting back to people in a reasonable time. Maybe I'll just end by saying, we're a relatively small organization, and we do have a provincial mandate, and we are consistent in implementing that. However, we're not a large bureaucracy. We're small staff, and we pride ourselves, as Christian said, and as Christian said, on being a solutions-based organization, and also responding to people contacting me directly and having conversations to find solutions. I think that's it for my piece. I think we'll have a break. I'll hand it to Katrina.
Thank you, Mike and Kristen, for walking us through the presentation. So we know that there's going to be a few questions and comments. So we will take a 5-minute recession just so you can take all that information, think about what you want to ask. There are multiple ways to ask questions. You can post them directly in the chat, as some of you have been doing. Thank you for that. You can also raise your hand. So at the top of the bar, for those of you who are not familiar with Teams, there's a reactions button. If you click reactions, there's a hand raise function, and we ask that you do that, and then we will go question by question as they come in. There are a couple of questions that are in the chat that I would take. I'll just take a minute to speak to. Someone asked about whether board members are present this evening. They are. We have invited our full authority board as well as members of our planning and permitting ad hoc committee to hear the comments from those who are here tonight and to understand kind of the next steps that staff are going to be using moving forward. Many of you are asking about timelines for next steps. We will be taking tonight's feedback and into consideration with the feedback that we've received through this public consultation process, and we'll be drafting new guidelines. Bringing those new drafts forward, and a summary of our of the consultation period will depend on the timing of when our planning permitting ad hoc committee will meet. Our intention is to meet in October to have some discussion. And at this point, again, we will be reviewing all of our feedback and using that to inform our next steps. So I'll leave it there for now. We will take a 5-minute break again, so you can consolidate your thoughts, and we will be back shortly to answer your questions and concerns. Thanks, everybody.
Okay. Harold, two things. We had two devastating floods, Here we go.
Okay, we are back here. Thank you for that pause and for some of the comments in the chat. And we do see that some hands are coming up. So I do want to take a minute to answer a couple comments that we didn't get to. The first was about timing with new councils moving into next year. So as part of our next phase, we will be bringing a process update to our Planning and Permitting Ad Hoc Committee as well as our Full Authority Board this fall. And we will discuss timing on when the next phase of the guidelines will be reviewed and potential further consultation, as well as discussion on how to engage new board members and new councils on the process. Another comment that was brought forward is notice. So what happens is we pull all the comments together, we create new drafts, and we bring that forward to our board committees and our full authority board. Those are public meetings where participants are able to listen in, and those agendas, as well as all reports and recommendations that are viewed in open session, are posted on our website. So we can commit to provide a notice to everybody in attendance today and those who have provided comments on notice for when those reports are on our website. So you can go take a look and inform yourselves on where staff are thinking and the next stage in the process. So at this point, I will look for a couple hands and then we'll refer back to the chat. So first on the list is Donald Patterson. If you'd like to unmute and ask your question, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. I must say I enjoyed your professional presentation tonight. I think you answered many of the concerns that were being discussed in the community. My question relates to the floods of 2017 and the floods of 2019. I used to work with the hydro systems out west, and we always had concerns about floods, and one of the major components of determining how the dams are operated was to do snowpack monitoring and to work over a period of time what the firm, secondary firm, and surplus power would be based upon the snowpacks. There are a number of dams that were built in Canada that were to control the potential floodings. Those dams are currently now being or have been converted into hydroelectric facilities that provided tremendous benefits to Canada and the United States, and that they increased the firm power on the Columbia River and its tributaries by almost 60%. And that was split between Canada and the United States. My concern is the river, the way it's currently being operated, seems to be based upon seaway. And how many ships, what is the load capacity of those ships when they want to go to the inland port facilities? I remember when the seaway was being built, I remember the river cycles of 7 years up, 7 years down. It was a natural process. The seaway changed that. I was hoping that your agency might be able to create someone to monitor the snowpacks so the potential for floods like 2017 and 2019 that caused millions of damages. In Canada, they cost me probably somewhere over $100,000 in damages because we've never seen water that high.
Thank you.
And I hope that you will be able to do something to help protect the river and its environment by getting input so the Seaway Authority will know better how to operate its dams.
Thank you for your comment. Thank you for your comment, Mr. Patterson. So discussion on the dam operation is outside of the scope of this evening. However, we do have a monitoring program for inland lakes within our watershed. We do not, or we are not part of the control or monitoring of efforts on the St. Lawrence River. But I do encourage you, if you want to send in that question to our team, we are more than happy to provide a fulsome response on what we can do and how we can partner with other agencies to answer your question.
May I answer and just say this? My question is, your influence with the Seaway Authority, I know, is probably non-existent in many ways. But you do have the ability to monitor the snowpacks and the runoff potentially in the area of your responsibility. And that probably would be a very good political piece of information to have in trying to protect the environment you're responsible for.
Thank you. Thank you for the comment. So we do have a snowpack monitoring program, again, on our inland lakes. More information can be found on that on our website, and we share that information with partners across our watershed, including the IJC, so they are aware of the information that we collect. So again, just to keep on scope and to be respectful of those here in attendance, I will move on, but do appreciate the question this evening.
Thank you.
Next on this list is Mr. John Paul Jackson. You have the floor if you would like to unmute.
Thank you. Oops. Can you hear me okay?
You can, go ahead.
Okay. First off, I'd like to say thank you, Katrina, for following the chats. You answered a lot of the questions that I had, as well as in the presentation, a great many were answered as well. But I do want some clarification on a couple of points, and I'm going to ask all the questions. I have 4, I think, and then I'll let you go. First off, can you describe to us what kind of experience the board members have outside of them simply being elected officials from each of the municipalities? The next one is, you indicated that you were going to remove the legal non-conforming changes, the wording of it, from the proposed changes, but during further conversation, whoever was speaking, I'm sorry, I can't remember who said it, but you indicated that regardless of removing it, any development on a legal non-conforming grandfathered structure would still potentially involve CRCA, and thus it really, all you're really doing is taking it out of the proposed changes. You're still potentially going to impose your authority over legal non-conforming infrastructure. My last question is, Kehoe Construction, through their legal counsel, has provided the CRCA with their position on the majority of the changes that you are recommending. Will the public get a copy of your response to the Kehoe's legal counsel? Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. So I can answer a couple, and then I will turn one over to our team here. So the first one on board member experience, we, through our board meetings and through sessions of council, we educate our board members on the different processes, on the research done within our watershed and all that goes on, so that they are informed before they make decisions. The way we bring our reports forward is we provide all the necessary background and facts so that board members can feel educated. They then ask us questions to go back and provide them more information so that they can be informed before they make decisions. With regards to Kehoe Construction and the response that they provided us, we have been reviewing as part of our internal feedback process. Those comments will be incorporated into our overall summary to the Planning and Permitting Ad Hoc Committee, and where feasible, we will take those comments and incorporate them into our next draft. So all of the comments that was received from any of the different players will be incorporated into our next draft in our reviewing process. We will not be providing a response to each and every comment that was provided. The last question, I believe, had to do with legal non-conforming rights, and so I will pass that over to Mike Dakin, and he can hopefully answer your question.
Yeah, thanks, Katrina. To answer the question about legal non-conforming rights, I have to reiterate that legal non-conforming rights, if they're a Planning Act matter, we're discussing tonight the Conservation Authorities Act. They are separate legislation. Nonetheless, there are questions, concerns about grandfather rights. Can I rebuild my dwelling? Can I rebuild structure? We will, as we always have, work with individuals on a case-by-case basis to look at the circumstances, to understand what's the rationale behind the reconstruction. Are there opportunities to make improvements? Because remember, at the end of the day, we're interested in natural hazards protection, natural hazards avoidance. However, again, we'll work with each individual on a case-by-case basis. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Katrina. My apologies. I did have one more, and it's about floating boathouses. We have our floating homes. We have several in the Ivy Lee area. Are any changes within the proposed changes applicable to those types of homes? My apologies for leaving that.
That's okay. I will turn it over to Mike.
Yeah, I could answer that one quickly. No, none of the existing guidelines are proposed to be changed as it relates to floating boathouses. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We will move on to the next hand. So I see Mako Docks. You have your hand up. The floor is yours if you'd like to unmute.
Yeah, hi, it's Aaron George here from Mako Docs. How are you doing? I appreciated the transparency you guys operated this with. It was really well done. I just wanted to ask two specific dock building questions, which you could have imagined. So two things I was curious about the details of. Your skirt regulations or vertical staving or however it's going to be. I believe it was Kirsten was saying that they're to be above the high water mark. They're just, I know these are internal regulations and more just add structure to how permits are evaluated. But I see what you were saying about how they can impact neighboring properties and water flow. However, in my experience, I've noticed that, you know, especially on Lake Ontario and the river, if those skirts aren't low enough, they make the docks unusable to most boats with a freeboard. You know, with most boats, freeboard is about 20 inches or lower. So my real question was, how are we going to address that if the water levels are going down 3 feet on the Lake Ontario and St. Lawrence River, and it's plus or minus, how are we going to use our docks and the docks we build for our customers if they are at the high water mark? Because, and especially with wave action, they can drive them under the dock. The second question would be just for the primary uses of boat ports that are used for decks as well, just to not waste the space and to have a nice area to sit on. I know you were saying there were some modifications made to that, but I was looking, if the primary use is as a boat port, and I know they're not going to be encouraged, but if the primary use is as a boat port, are the boat ports with flat roof decks still discouraged, or is that just only if they are, their primary use is to be a rooftop deck and not necessarily for boating in particular? Thanks.
Thank you for your question. So I will turn it over to both Kristen and Mike, and you can tag team and answer there.
So I can start off. So to clarify, the staving, we're not restricting to a minimum, I guess, length near the high water mark. What we were saying is that we don't want to see them directly touching the bed of the lake. So we're looking for some form of gap, and again, that can be flexible, understanding that we are dealing with fluctuating water levels. So we're seeing extreme highs and extreme lows, especially over the next coming, or the past years, and inevitably into the future. So I just want to make it clear, it's not that we were restricting that dock staving needs to be above the high water level. It's just that we don't necessarily want to see them directly touching the bed of the lake, so there is no gap. And again, that is, we've left flexibility there to not necessarily require or restrict what that length looks like, understanding that it's going to differ from property to property. So hopefully that answers your first question. And the second question associated with the flat roof boathouses and boat ports. So I wouldn't necessarily say they would be discouraged. Our policies will not change. So if we do get proposals for new flat roofed boathouses or boat ports, then that is something that staff will be able to continue supporting for permit approval under our regulatory guidelines.
I could just add to Kristen's answers there. As you had said, I think you're inferring that the focus would be on ensuring that those aren't directly designed for uses that they're not intended, and that's exactly it. Yeah, it could be seen as a waste of space to have a flat roof and not allow seating. That's not our intent whatsoever. And from hearing the feedback from the public, we realize that that's not an appropriate change to make. So we've proposed, and we'll take it to our planning and permitting ad hoc committee to remove that restriction. I just want to also touch on some of the comments about placing chairs and materials on docks. That's really not our intent. I would hope that would have been clear in the presentation tonight and in the materials itself. Not quite sure where that confusion came from, but that is definitely not the intent of the Conservation Authority. We have no role in terms of what you place on a dock. where we do have a role is the general configuration of that dock and making sure that it remains a dock, instead of uses and structures that we have seen pressure for, that would generally not be appropriate in the water and therefore in a hazard area. So again, hopefully that answers your question. Thanks.
Yes, it did. Thank you very much. Have a good night.
Thank you, and thanks, Mike and Kristen. I don't see any other hands. I'll give it a couple minutes to see if anyone has questions. I believe we've answered most in the chat. I'll just ask that here.
Yeah, I've seen one in chat, somebody asking if they can repair their 100-plus-year-old cottage when a microburst knocks it off its footings.
That's a valid question. We have that happen. Mother Nature can wreak havoc, and we recognize certainly that there are situations outside of people's control, and we certainly wouldn't restrict reconstruction in those circumstances. We have policies that allow for that. I'd add, as is our responsibility, we work with you to ensure that, say, that 100-year-old cottage is in an area that's at risk of flooding or erosion. We'd work with you to find ways to better protect that. But we recognize there are situations like that that are out of our control, out of individual landowners' control, and we will absolutely work with you in those circumstances.
Thank you. Okay, a couple hands have come up. So Charles Kidd, your hand is up. You have the floor. Please unmute.
Am I unmuted?
You are. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much. I'm not all that experienced with this technology. I just wanted to thank you folks for tonight's effort and alleviating my concerns, and to make a comment on some of the more positive aspects of what I saw about a month or so ago. And I was very impressed with moving from the tape measure rule to something based on more knowledge and experience on the part of staff, experienced staff at the CRCA, in terms of, okay, what can you do and what can you not do? And instead of just sort of relying on what a tape measure says. One of the things that I thought was what might work is, especially with the high water levels and the low water levels that we're dealing with in the last few years. I mean, let's face it, we're faced with what Mother Nature presents to us. Okay, what do we do about this? There's the docks and the boathouses and stuff that are intrinsically right at the water ledge, and then there's the cottages and the buildings that are set back from it. And if we want to go and do anything, it's sort of, what do we do that we're going to minimize the risk, which is a joint wish. I'm thinking of some sort of education aspect of the thing, best practices, as in sort of, okay, you've got a cottage, you want to put up a deck or something like that. What is the best practice, which is not only in your best interest, but would be likely approved, and something on your website might be valuable and prevent a lot of upset people. Yeah, I'll end my rant right now. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We appreciate the feedback, and we will take that comment on best management practices and review it internally and determine what education materials that we can create. We are constantly looking on what information to put on the website and what would be helpful to landowners. So at any point, even after this update process, if anyone has suggestions that you would like us to consider, please email us and we will bring that into our process.
Thank you.
She didn't speak. They're keeping very trim.
Okay, so I'm looking at the chat. Next on the list is Ken White. You have the floor. Please unmute.
He's one of ours. GIA.
Can you hear me okay?
You can. Go ahead, Ken.
Oh, good. Yeah, thank you very much for making an attempt to communicate with all of us. Well, we certainly came here with a lot of questions. I got several quick comments. This is my 68th year on this river. So I've been around a while. And it's amazing how many stupid things we do building on the river and how much help we need. And so just a couple of things jumped out at me. The definition of rivers, streams, runoff, wetlands, creeks. I seriously am worried that's a rat hole for lawyers, because I happen to know that CRCA got involved with the ditch next to a driveway right where I've parked my boat since the late 60s, that it's a stream. No, it's a runoff ditch. And, you know, that severely gets in the way of construction and managing your own property. So I'm worried about threats on property rights here. The avoidance versus protection, that makes sense. Shoreline management, risk abatement, and so forth. They're all important things with the fluctuations in water levels to protect against unnecessary risk. But these are all soft terms that are extremely hard to define. And I challenge any of you to predict the future, because we can't, you know? So that's another point. There's problems there, and if things aren't laid out specifically, there's going to be a lot of litigation, a lot of wasted time, a lot of wasted money. I just had the thought of what we need from the previous comment. We need leadership versus enforcement. And right now, all of this is looked at as an enforcement, as a regulation, getting in the way of progress. We need that help. I like the idea of best practices. That's pretty cool. That's like being a river rat for over 50 years. In terms of today's program, I really didn't see much new. I got much more out of reading your literature and commenting on it. The audio was poor. Way too much information came way too fast to absorb it. And, you know, it's just difficult. The intro to the Q&A, there should have been bullet points with all of those words that barraged us on how things were being handled. Wasn't there. I've got a lot of background in Zoom productions, expert witness and everything else. So you know, I understand presenting an argument. In terms of the flood level comments, yeah, I realize you have no influence over the IJC. I specialize in water level education for the Thousand Islands Association and for our region. So we're very, very familiar with that, what can and can't be done. And there are situations where the whole seaway, the whole watershed, water levels in Lake Ontario are not controllable. Too much rain and too much incoming water and everything all together. There are non-controllable situations. I'd really like to see more done to protect our environment and to focus on helping us do things right here. I can't believe that I got through this whole conversation and finally understood the statement about, which was made very clearly, staves must be at high level, high water level. That's absurd. And yet there's a picture, the pictures weren't labeled. I saw a picture of sort of a dock right next to the land there with staves going down to rocks and so forth, no water near it. What you're talking about is water under the staves from a land-based thing. Totally poorly represented, but I'm glad I finally understood based on one of the questions here. So anyhow, the whole discussion about flat roofs and so forth, there was a picture shown in there of a boat port that had a pointed roof and it had a flat roof. No labeling whatsoever. Which one was okay? You didn't teach the point to me. And I still like to know if a flat roof along with a pointed roof is okay. And how does me not being able to store my stuff that I use on my boat protect my neighbors? So anyhow, these are some questions I've got. We've got a long way to go here, but thank you for giving us the opportunity to share.
Thank you very much. We appreciate those comments. There were a couple suggestions in there. We will take those under review as part of our process. I know there are also a couple questions in there, so I'll open the floor to staff. I think we can answer a couple of them, but we appreciate the feedback.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you very much.
Right, yeah, no, they were really constructive comments, Ken, I appreciate that. Two things about the definitions under our regulation, those are set, sometimes by the province. What we can do, where we have authority or where we have control is how we implement or interpret those definitions. I understand you're concerned about the ditch versus a natural water course. That's a concern and a debate we have on a daily basis, but I can say we make all efforts to ensure that when we're implementing the regulation, we're focusing on the intent, and that is to prevent flooding and erosion. If it's a roadside ditch, a ditch along your driveway, we don't have an interest there. If there's a specific circumstance that you recall, I'm happy to have a discussion about that, and perhaps we could learn from that. But overall, roadside ditches and watercourses, they're just not within the scope of our review and our interest. We're looking at water bodies and watercourses that convey flooding and represent erosion risk for that purpose. Secondly, just on the staving, I don't want to beat it to death, but I think the easiest way to think about it is we don't intend to restrict how staving touches the water, how far it goes into the water. What we are trying to do is ensure that there's an appropriate gap between the bed of the river, the bed of the lake, and that staving to allow for current, allow for natural processes to occur. Because we know if we cut those off and we create an obstruction, that can have implications for adjacent landowners, for the structure itself. So that's just a general best practice. And hopefully that is clear at the end of the day. We're not restricting staving from going in the water. I don't know if there's anything I missed or if anybody wants to add.
Okay, thank you. And I will just add that we recognize that there's a lot of information this evening. That was one of the reasons we recorded the session. And so the recording will be made available on our website for anybody to go back and slow it down and take a look at or re-listen to some of the points. One of the reasons that we're verbalizing a lot of these updates is because a lot of text on the screen can be very hard to follow. So again, hopefully the recording will be helpful and can be viewed in the future. Okay, so we'll move on with the comments then. I see a hand from Wade Coulter. Wade, if you're with us, you can unmute and the floor is yours.
Yeah, hi there. Thanks for the presentation. I've actually worked with you and had some approvals that went very smoothly for me, and that was great. When I first saw the new proposed changes, it worried me a bit. It seemed overreaching, as I think is why you got a reaction from a lot of the people on this call today. But I think that you've clarified it today. And there's one thing that I think you've got your hands full with, and I just want to make the observation. And that's the differentiation between the St. Lawrence River, an international waterway, and the inland lakes that you're also covering. And that by trying to align with regulations from a UNESCO World Heritage Site and the St. Lawrence River, which sometimes becomes the waste gates for other cities, which is not regulated by CRCA, which has tour boats going by and crashing into the shores of everybody's properties after the poker run, after the jet skis, etc. It seems to me one size doesn't fit all, and that so the question, I guess, is there any possibility or intent to say the St. Lawrence River, an international waterway, is different and should be treated different? Because certainly when you look at the habits of those using the waterway and what's permitted there, whether it be speedboats, whether it be bass fishing season before the bass are off their nests, as happened this year, and you watch the nursing fish removed, it just seems to me that there's a big difference between the St. Lawrence and the rest of the area.
Thank you for the comment. I'll pass it over to staff.
Thanks, Katrina. That's a very good question or point, comment, Wade. The regulation and the guidelines do, as they stand, they do differentiate the policies for development structures, docks, etc. on Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence River versus the inland lakes and water bodies, recognizing that the forces at play are completely different. So at the offset, there are fundamental differences there. Probably more importantly, our approach as staff when we're going out and dealing with a property, when we're looking at an application, we're thinking differently when we're dealing with the St. Lawrence River property than we are on a small inland lake. We recognize that things have to be built a certain way, that there are extenuating circumstances, as you said, where boat wakes and current ice
I don't know. You want to listen to this?
are tremendously more impactful than on the inland water bodies. So that is a good point, and it does align with our approach.
Okay, thank you. Looking at the hands, and there's not another one yet, so I'll pause, but I'll turn it over to staff if there's any comments in the chat. Go ahead.
Yes, a question from Sarah Kehoe. We understand that South Nation Conservation Authority completed a peer review. Will it be released to the public?
Yeah, and I can speak to that. We consulted closely with South Nation as we did with other conservation authorities near us, including Rideau Valley Conservation Authority to the north, Quinte Conservation to the west, essentially all conservation authorities in Eastern Ontario to ensure that there's a level of consistency there. So we had good constructive conversations with them. Our general approach was supported by South Nation. Of course, there are some minor differences in how we implement our regulation. That's a factor of geography, a factor of other attributes. But fundamentally, we came to the conclusion that there was a satisfactory level of consistency, and we'll continue to hear from them and advise them on their processes. But at the end of the day, yeah, we worked closely with South Nation.
Yeah, any other comments or questions in the chat? Not at this time, okay. I have seen some comments and we have heard just about the public consultation process and communicating with the broader community. We try to do a targeted approach. We try to reach as many people as possible. If you have any suggestions on how to reach other organizations, residents, etc., we are very open to that. We will use the network that we have built through this public consultation process in future and to continue the conversation. But again, if you have any thoughts on how to reach others, please drop them in the chat, send us an email, and we will incorporate that into our future process. I do see another hand from Ken White. Not seeing anybody else. Ken, you have the floor once again. Please unmute.
Thank you. Yeah, two more things came to my mind. Number one, I would be really interested in the municipalities' reactions to your proposals, because there's a real issue about overlap of authority on a lot of things that we call building codes up here. Believe me, the restrictions are no fun sometimes when we want to do something special, but I can see it getting worse. And, you know, I know the township of Leeds and the Thousand Islands, where I'm a resident, they have $140,000 or something like that as a line item on money that flows to you all. Now, are they happy with the expenditure of that money? Is that useful to them? Are there ways they need help where they can't have coverage, or you can work together? That's question one. And the other one, I gotta find my notes here. Yeah, oh, it has to do with, in all this consultation, which happens every 5 years, happening right now. I never heard or saw a question from you all saying, how can we help you? Because there are certain areas where we all feel pretty powerless to stop stupid things from happening for a variety of reasons. And if this whole process really needs to be public driven, township driven, help us. It needs to be a two-way thing, and it doesn't have that feel yet, but maybe we can get there. So that was the second statement comment. Thank you for allowing me to speak twice, double dipping.
Thank you for your comments, Ken. So in terms of municipalities, I can say that we have a very good relationship with our municipal partners and we work very closely with them. This guideline update was circulated to municipalities and we did receive comments, which I can let staff speak to if they wish. But we do have constant conversations about how to work together on the process and how to work with landowners in order to achieve what the intent is on the landscape. In terms of the second point on, how we can help you, we are always open to feedback on that point. We appreciate the opportunity to have a discussion with you, and we'll again consider that as part of our future processes. If you have any suggestions outside of this meeting or any time in the future on anything that we do, please reach out and let us know, and we will try and incorporate that into our future discussions and processes moving forward. So I'll just turn it over to staff in case there's any comments or responses.
Katrina, may I? No, I don't have these comments, but regarding the line item on our budget in the township.
Sure, just before. So we have Councillor Olkey here in the room with us. He is a board member with us, and he does have a comment, so I will turn it over to you. Go ahead. You can speak here.
Yes, good evening. Raising the issue of the line item on our budget, $140,000 plus. If we're not a member of this conservation authority, we would have to provide many of the services ourselves. And this was done in years past, perhaps not to a very satisfactory level. If you put together all the townships and pool all the money, you get a certain synergy of skills and talents that we could not provide on our own. And that's the reason why we do it. The other municipalities are involved as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Olkey. Again, I'll turn it over to staff if there's any comments.
I just want to add, with regards to cooperation with municipalities, that them being, essentially our governing authorities, elected representatives such as Councillor Olkey on our board, we do strive to maintain that good relationship. What's sometimes confusing, even for staff, let alone the public, is we've got multiple roles, and tonight's discussion really is about the regulation, which is, I think I said before, but the regulations under the Conservation Authorities Act, and that is separate from the Planning Act, that's separate from the Municipal Act. That's not to say there isn't overlap, there certainly is, and what we try to do when we're looking at, say, planning applications is make sure at the end of the day that somebody's proposing something through the Planning Act, that we're able to support that once they come to get a permit. That's just good planning, I guess. So we have that role, but at the end of the day, they are separate pieces of legislation, and we have certain boundaries, I guess, or certain requirements that we have to stay within. But again, end of the day, we're working with each and every municipality as much as we can. We welcome feedback from them. It's incredibly valuable. I know there's quite a few staff and council members from different municipalities on the call tonight.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, looking to the chat again, are there any comments or questions? Not seeing any. Any other hands going up? Any other questions from members of the public this evening? Let everybody think for a couple more minutes, and just want to reiterate, thank you for taking the time this evening to join us. And we hope that this education session, or engagement session, I should say, has been helpful. If there are any outstanding comments, we look forward to hearing them over the coming weeks. And we will, as noted, provide a notice to all those who have attended and have provided comments on when our milestone meetings to our committee and to our board will happen, and when those reports and agendas are on our website for public viewing. Okay, I don't see any more hands. Calling one more time. No further comments on the chat. Okay, so this recording will be made available on our website over the next week, and we can send a notice on when it's there for those who are interested in viewing. You can share the link with anyone who may be interested. And again, we thank everybody for attending, for your constructive comments, for keeping it respectful and consideration of time. And then with that, not seeing any comments,